we have a few more joiners still. Give people just a moment. Quite a few folks. Some names I recognise, several I don't. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time it is where you are, those of you who are joining from, I know, all over the place.
Yes. You want to jump in? I think we're recording this.
Yeah, I think we've got most people who are in the waiting room and now in the room. So why don't we crack on? I hope you can all see my screen there. You've got my slides. I'm going to try not to bore you with too many slides today. I'm going to keep it a little bit of a free flowing conversation. But Tarek, thank you for having me on. Do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, I think, the third webinar we've done in 2025 around this entire concept of thought leadership and internal communication. I thought it was important. I'll introduce myself in a second, but I thought this entire series was important because as we'd seen going to different events, internal communication is so walled off. Unlike marketing, they can't really see what great looks like. They can't see best practices because it's so internal, no pun intended. And so I thought this series would be good to really unearth what's the best of the best. What are people thinking about in terms of best practices? What's working, what's not working. And so I've invited various thought leaders to join me for these conversations. And I think and hope that they're helpful and informational. So we can go to the next slide, Sharon, and I'll kind of
do some intros.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that?
Glad that you're joining me. So just a brief background. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Circle. I know it's spelled weird. I'm not a marketer, but it's pronounced circle. And the idea is a feedback loop. So communication should be a feedback loop. And that's where Circle comes from. We have a product in market today called Broadcast. It's a full suite internal communication platform. We'll take a look at bits and pieces of that throughout this conversation. But really, I wanted to turn the mic over to my guest today, Sharon O'Day, coming to us live from my favorite city in the world, Amsterdam.
Thank you. Hello, and thank you for inviting me on. That challenge you described was one that's really familiar when I was in-house. You've got, as an internal communicator, it's very difficult to get visibility of what other people are doing. And you're often, a small team or just one person working on your own, often trying to try new things, understand what works for your organization. And I always remember when I was in-house finding it really useful to get those insights on what other people are doing and also what other industries are doing that we can learn from and borrow from as well. And also how vendors are responding to the challenge and the evolving marketplace. So, introduce myself, that would help. I'm Sharon O'Day, and I am one of the co-founders of Lithos Partners, and we are a boutique consultancy, and we help organizations with digital workplace, digital employee experience, and digital communications. So we help people find the right platforms, but also the things they need to get that right, which is processes, and also the right kind of people and skills they need to make the most of their digital channels. As of last week, I'm also about to be an author. So I'm writing a book called Digital Communications at Work, which is exactly about all this kind of thing, how to establish and run channels to make internal communications work in the workplace. So I'm really excited to get talking about some of that. And this aligned with a lot of the research that I've been doing for the book as well. So thank you very much for having me on. Why don't I quickly, sorry, carry on.
No. Well, today's topic, near and dear to my heart, personalization. And specifically when we think about personalizing internal communication to drive engagement and relevance. So you've put together this amazing agenda. So I'm going to kick it back to you and you can walk us through what we're in store for. And let me just set the foundation. All of this, everything that you see today, including recording of this, all the slides. We also turn this entire conversation into a 20-minute podcast. So if people are too busy, they'll be able to listen to a recap of this in podcast format. So you'll be getting an email right after this webinar concludes. Okay, housekeeping check. Let's dive into the agenda.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. And actually, we'll touch on exactly that later about how people have different needs and they might want to consume the same content in different formats depending on the approach they have. So, can you attend a webinar, or would it be more appropriate to receive exactly the same information in a podcast? I'm sure I'll pick that thread up later. So, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to join us. What I want to cover today is, as you say, not just about personalization, but how do we scale personalization inside our organizations and ensure that we cut through the noise that so many of us are experiencing right now, and ensuring that everyone gets things that are relevant to them. So I want to start off by kind of talking about that challenge, the challenge of information overload and why relevance it really particularly matters now as we're getting so much more information. I want to touch on some definitions then as well, the difference between personalization and targeting, and also how you might use both of those. Some of the benefits of personalization and targeting and relevance more generally, and then get into some sort of best practices. So what are our best practices? What are the tools that we can use to personalize, to improve relevance, and also how we can scale that in our organizations. I want to talk a little bit then also about the power of choice. So what we've got so many different tools now to give people information that's relevant to them. How do we enable people to choose the things that they want to receive as well? And finally, I just want to wrap up with a little bit of time at the end to just a few takeaways that you can use, hopefully, and I open for some questions, of which I hope we have a few. Does that sound good?
It sounds great to me. If you do have questions, don't have to wait. So there's a Q&A option. Just go ahead and type in your question. We'll be monitoring that. So you don't have to wait till the end, but if you want to wait to the end, there will be a section just for Q&A.
Yeah, we'll see about, we maybe pick up some if they're relevant to the flow, if we see questions come in. If not, we'll save them to the end, see how we do for time. Fantastic. Why don't I then have a look at the challenge then? How big this challenge of information overload is. Oh, yeah, cool. So I wanted to really talk today about like cutting through the noise. We've all got so much going on right now, and how do we make sure that the messages that we send out as communicators are cutting through and ultimately delivering the value that we would hope they do. And we have to do that not just by shouting louder or saying more. I had one client recently come up with a phrase, when they don't believe that channels are working, they send more to make sure, and it made me cringe thinking about just sending more and more information out. What we need to do is not just talk louder, but send the right thing, say the right thing to the right person at the right time so that it's useful to them. Because the reality is that employees are just overwhelmed, by messages, by apps, by notifications, and yes, stuff from comms too. So I read a Gartner stat a while back that said that 38% of employees feel buried just in email. That's leaving aside Teams and Slack and all the other bits and pieces they might get. So these are some numbers that I picked out here. The average knowledge worker gets 121 emails a day. But then you add into that, the pings, the posts, the pop-ups. We've got Teams, we've got Slack, we've got Workplace, we've got Yammer, whatever it is, you name it. And when you add in all of those tools as well, you're getting 250, 300 messages every single day. It's exhausting, right? I mean, how was your inbox today?
It's always overflowing, and 90% of it is unopened.
Yeah.
It sits in the
I'm going to look at
someday
your phone
I'll
now and see
read
what that number
those.
is at the bottom.
Yeah, it's
2,665 unread. Is yours in the tens of thousands?
it's quite a bit. It was interesting. So when I was thinking about this fundamental problem of disengagement, this is years ago, and what led to the creation of Circle was this one statistic. So this statistic blew my mind when I saw it. The amount of content we create back then it was 3 hours, it's probably every hour now, is more than all of the content created from the beginning of time to 2003 combined. So every book, every piece of music, every movie, everything, we eclipse that in probably an hour now with how much content is being created. And a lot of that has come from, I think, unintended consequences, which we'll talk about, is companies keep layering on more channels because, as
Hmm.
you said, we have to reach them. And
Yeah.
so the one thing I've learned for certain is there is no one magic channel that leads to engagement. Everyone is different, which is really the whole point of this conversation. How do you reach people in the way they want to be reached, the channel they want to be reached? All of it is about them to drive maximum engagement.
Yeah, and AI is kind of a bit like that Homer Simpson meme, the cause of and solution to the problem. That actually in this world where content is easier to create than ever, we've just got, on the one hand, that's great. It means that we can do some really interesting things with, remixing content to make it work harder for people. But it does also mean we've just got so much more of it happening. So how do we also use the power of those tools to help people just, sort the wheat from the chaff, to find what's important for them, to give people what they need, and ultimately to deliver value for people and for our organizations. So on the one hand, I think we're all drowning in so much AI dross. On the other, there's so much potential in some of these tools to help us deal with this avalanche of stuff that we all have to deal with every day. So when there's too much noise, important updates get missed. And people just stop listening altogether, all those unread messages. But when that happens, you don't just lose eyeballs, right? You lose trust, you lose alignment, you lose connection. So when people are faced with this avalanche of content, this avalanche of messaging and comms and notifications and pings and everything they're getting from everyone else, the the impact of our communications goes down. Ultimately, measures of that like engagement go down, but it also adds to this nagging sense that work isn't quite working. So, it adds to frustration. Why am I getting this? What does this mean? And all of this, wading through all of these updates also adds to that sense of burnout that so many people are reporting. It feels like a tiny thing, and one email on its own is a tiny thing, but it all adds up to eroding our sense of well-being. And that sense, so many more stats of people reporting that they just feel a little bit swamped
Death,
by
death
work.
by a thousand cuts.
Yeah, or a thousand emails, right?
Yes, I think that's accurate. We talk about it in the next slide, and it gets me to think
Segue
about,
neatly, thank you.
yes, it
Mhm.
gets me to think about this line that we've heard over and over and over, that we live in the information age.
Yeah,
I think that's a lie. We live in the attention age. It
okay.
is so hard to get someone's attention. And it's not rocket science because it's all around us. So we wanted to, like, everybody engages with Netflix and Amazon and Hulu and Spotify. Right. They're not surveying us because they don't have to. Everywhere you go across every channel on these platforms, it's tailored to me.
Yeah,
They don't care if I consume Netflix on my phone, my laptop, my TV, and it's a contiguous experience. I can stop here, restart there. So the
yeah,
channel is not the answer. Like, we are seeing how to do this effectively through all the consumer brands that we engage with every day. So then the question becomes, how do we have that a similar level of relevance
yeah.
within your company to your people?
And you raise a really interesting point there, that our expectations of our digital channels aren't set by the thing that we use at work. It's the thing that we use every day in our everyday lives. So there is the sense of like, why, well, how does everyone else get it right? And I'm not getting this, the things that are relevant or even in vaguely suitable for me at work. Why am I getting messages about things that just aren't in any way pertinent to the work that I do? The Spotify example is a great one, that if you ever go on your Discover Weekly mix, you're like, how did you know this song that I liked 20 years ago and haven't listened to since? It's the data they have is so rich, they can give everyone that really unique experience that really cuts through and means that, it is everyone, one of most people's most used apps, right? Providing that cut through, that
Uh,
relevance.
yes, I would. I've never heard of Jerry Cinnamon. He's an Ireland or
I
a
do know Jerry Cinnamon, yeah.
Scottish guy. I love him. There's
Yeah,
no way I would have ever heard of Jerry Cinnamon if not for Spotify. And think about how many songs, books, podcasts are on Spotify. Millions, hundreds of millions. And yet it doesn't feel overwhelming at all
no,
because they know you. and they filter through the noise to bring you the signal.
I remember reading a while ago a piece on how Discover Weekly works, because it does have that. It's slightly scary. It's almost like it was a podcast, like a playlist made by someone who knows you so well that you could call them up and say, "Hi, can you help me hide a body?" It's so that sort of really, it knows more about you than anyone. It's extraordinary, but I think it does speak to that. Actually, our expectations for relevance are really super high now, and at work we often disappoint people by being a very long way from those elevated expectations that are set by Amazon, by Netflix, by Spotify, and by everything else.
That's true. And I think as we get into it and we kind of talk about the difference between personalization and targeting, and I'm sure people are joining this because they want to understand what are the practical things they could do. And as a technologist, I can tell you there's a crawl, walk, run, but
Mm-hmm.
this Netflix, Amazon, Spotify, Hulu that you love, that is now very feasible for you to bring to your own employees. We'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, actually, let's move on from the background then, because I could talk about Spotify all day, but you're right. We need to fix this problem of overwhelm, not with more comms, but with ensuring that every message people get has value. And we have the tools and we have the data, and those are the two, and we'll both talk about that, I think, a bit later. But how do we make sure that every message has value to the recipient, to the organization? And if it doesn't do either of those things, then it's just noise. And there is the question of, does it need to go to that person at all, or are we just adding to that? So it's sending the right thing to the right people. Not It is about saying less, I suppose, but also making it count, making every message count. Yeah, we get into the talking about targeting, about personalization, but also how relevance helps us to restore trust in the channels that we have. If people believe that what they'll see on any of these channels or receive by their email or whatever it might be is useful to them, then they are going to open it up more frequently. So let's move. Should we get cracking onto some of the definitions?
Let's get cracking.
Cool.
Yes.
Yes. So we talked about relevance, and how relevance is vital in cutting through the noise, but I wanted to really talk about how we achieve that in practice. So that's where I think we've got these two distinct ideas, the targeting and the personalization, because they often get lumped together. Do you find that sometimes with people you talk to about not necessarily being clear about what one ends and the other begins?
Yeah. So I think there is an order of operations. If you can't target effectively, you've already lost.
Yeah.
You could have content written by William Shakespeare. If it's sent to the wrong person, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of targeting. And so there is a very big difference, but you can never get to kind of this Netflix experience if you don't have the fundamental ability to target. And we see more times than not, internal communications is hamstrung because
Yeah.
they're reliant on IT, build this distribution list, or why is this out of date, or HR, pull the spreadsheet of all the new hires in the last 90 days in these locations. They can't do that on their own. So they're always waiting. And so it's not your data, you don't own it, you don't know how clean it is. So that would be kind of basic blocking and tackling, is how do we make targeting easier for internal communicators and not be dependent on other parts of the organization?
Yeah. And also some of that is also being confident with data, the ability to use it and to be able to do that targeting yourself. But like you say, you have to have the confidence that the data is accurate and that you're able to access it as and when you need it. And then, like you said, personalization is the layer above that. How do you tweak a message? Maybe we could get into a bit more depth on those two.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dive deeper.
Let's do that. So targeting then is, as you say, it's about using that information, those attributes we have, to send the right message to the right group of people. So at its most basic, it's taking that down from, this goes to all staff, to the people who genuinely need it, because it affects them, because they could do something with it. I kind of describe it as being like a torch or a spotlight. If your message is spotlight, target is where you aim it. So it's the who needs this bit. So, and as you said, this is really the basic beginning here, that where internal comms teams should start. They don't, as you say, they're not always able to do that because they may not have the right data, but this is at its bare minimum, ensuring that not every message goes to everyone, but rather that we can send things to people as and when they need them, so that we reduce that noise to a degree.
Yes. Couldn't agree more.
And then we've got the other side of the coin, the personalization. So this is more of a tactical layer, right? It's about making sure that the message feels like it's meant for you, not just for people like you. So that's stuff like adding in your name, sending the communications in your preferred language, if that were relevant. But it can also be, as you say, just a little bit like that Netflix experience, changing the layout based on whether you're reading it on a desktop or a mobile device. And then there's one layer beyond that, which is that, showing them local information based on where someone is physically based, right? So things like, I've shown some here, naming individual contacts that are local to you, translating it into preferred language, but also we can take it a layer above that, right? Using technology that we have. It's ensuring we get the message. So if targeting is making sure that who gets the message is the right person, personalization is about how it's shaped to resonate with them a bit more.
Yes, I think so. So I would say the targeting is, I've got the right group of people. And then within that group, personalization goes a step further. So add information, save me time, make me feel like this is a one-to-one communication, which is how Netflix makes me feel every time I log in, because it's so spot on based on what I've watched, where I left off. All of the things make it feel like, I'm the only subscriber they have. I don't know if they have 1 million or 200 million subscribers, because it's all tailored to me. So this is where it's an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
You must be able to target. And then let's talk about the next step of engagement, which is personalization. And then there's different levels of personalization.
And actually, so yeah, you talked about those different levels, those layers of maturity. And again, it's starting to build in that Netflix model. So using those hyper personalized attributes, that we've got the data, we now have the computing power to be able to give people more personalized experiences at scale. So, we can adjust a message based on the context in which someone might be likely to read it, or take that up one more layer as well. It's the hyper personalized based on behaviors. So that Netflix example, I know that you regularly watch, I don't know, crime documentaries. I don't know what that says about you or me, but it will show you content based on your preferences, your previous engagements.
Yep. So this is where kind of we get to that experience again, crawl, walk, run. So some personalization, high F name is better than none. The next piece would be, I also know that Sharon is constantly engaging with content around community service. That's really important to her. So that should be higher priority in her news than someone else who's not engaging with that. So that's the next level of personalization. And then I would say there's even a further level, which is understanding that Sharon has already consumed this piece of content on the intranet. Why is that included in her newsletter? Because we have all these channels, there's nothing wrong with it. How do we make sure we're not overwhelming and then creating the exact opposite effect of people start to tune us out because it's not relevant, because I have to put it on the intranet and I have to put it in Teams and I have to put it in the email and the newsletter. What if there was a way where we understood what Sharon loves, what she doesn't love, what she's seen, what she hasn't seen? Then I'm going to make one caveat eventually when we get to that this isn't marketing. And I know this is all internal communicators and I don't want them to yell at me. I get it. And I think your job is so much more difficult than marketing. You miss a sale this weekend, no one's going to lose their job or their benefits. With internal communications, there's required reading. This is why what you are trying to do is so unbelievably complex. Technology can be your friend.
Absolutely. So I want to open to a quick straw poll, although I appreciate we're already behind on slides. So let me just quickly, I wanted to get a sense of like where people think they are in their own maturity. So I'm going to see if I can make this poll thing work on here. Let's give this a go. Does that work? How mature is personalization in your organization? I've got a few answers already.
Do you have any guesses as to how this is going to turn out?
Well, I can see it on screen, so
A cheater. You are cheating.
I know. Actually, do you know what? It's broadly in line with what I would have expected. We've had about just over half of people respond. Okay, just in the interest of time, I'll just leave it there because I think it's pretty representative. Yeah, so what we're seeing actually is relatively low, that people are using some degree of targeting or segmentation, and then just a handful of people are further along that maturity scale, using dynamic personalization. So like you say, you know, moving content around based on what's relevant to people, but also that data-driven personalization and relevance. But generally speaking, those who are participating in this webinar, which I guess is why you're here, thank you, is to relatively early in that journey with some targeting, some segmentation, but not necessarily anything deeper than that. Thank you very much. I'll try to share those afterwards. What's our next slide then? So in the interest of time, should we just skip over this one and move into the how?
I'm sure people are dying now.
Yeah.
Help me get there.
I'm conscious we've got loads to get through. But this is where I think it was useful to have this distinction around, you know, it's about ensuring that if you personalize without having any sort of targeting, then it's just window dressing. But then equally, if you've got targeting without that personalization, it can just feel a little bit clinical. So actually, it's about how we use those two things together. Oh, where are we? Sorry, I'm going to go back to my notes. Again, briefly, maybe we kind of know what some of the impacts are here, but we did talk a little bit around, you know, when you do start to use some of those techniques, we do see huge gains in the levels of engagement that you get with content. I don't know if you want to quickly dive in on what you're seeing with some of your customers.
Yes, we see that. So high level, if you haven't heard of broadcast, basically the idea is how do we arm internal communicators with this technology? So you've already rolled out channels, and a lot of how people communicate really hasn't changed since the 90s. They'll create an email, they might post something on the intranet, and we don't have oftentimes even analytics. So the idea is, how do we have technology to create a consumer grade experience using the channels that you already have? So I'll give one example and then I'll give you some statistics. So an example might be we're changing the travel reimbursement policies for all VPs and above in North America. So instantly you need to be able to get to that audience. Hopefully, you know, you have that. If not, you got to go to HR, you got to go to IT. So one of the things that we do is you can build that audience yourself. You're not dependent. So that's step one, targeting. Keep those people in sync. I have my list, automatically takes seconds, not weeks. Two, instead of sending them an email, because you're sending communication to the most congested channel of all time, their inbox. I'm in their inbox. You saw how many unread emails Sharon has. What if you instead hit publish? So I have this piece of communication. It's targeted to VPs and above in North America, and I just hit publish. Now, when anyone in that target audience goes to any of those connected channels, Slack, Teams, newsletter, intranet, could be mobile, that is front and center for them. So you need to know this thing. So this is where communicators have this caveat of, I don't really care what their interests are. They must know this. So that is how we break through the noise and make sure they're seeing what they see. Now, when we roll this out, we see massive lifts in engagement across all channels because now it's tailored. you're not seeing things that you've already seen. So if I were to see that travel reimbursement policy change piece of content on the intranet, not in my newsletter, I have already read this. The newsletter will be filled with other things that I have not yet read that I still need to see or want to see. If I go to Teams, it's not my lead story.
Yeah.
I've already seen it somewhere else. So the entire concept is bring Netflix inside the workplace and make sure that the communicators still have control so people see what they need to see. Now, when we roll this out, on average, we're seeing double in terms of click rates because newsletters are all relevant to them. More times than not, it's even more than, because click rates are so low. We're seeing 10%, 15%, 20% click rates, not open rates. And then you're seeing 16, 20% increases in open rates because the subject line is built for Sharon.
Yeah.
You have 10,000 employees, 10,000 versions of what's going on based on what people haven't yet seen. So communicators get more reach and employees get more relevance.
And for me, what's really interesting then is when you build that into a systemic layer, the secondary benefits. So those second order effects, when employees consistently get comms that are relevant to them, something more powerful happens. That trust starts to build. They stop seeing comms as corporate spam and start seeing as something that is actually relevant to them. Why are you just telling them the same thing over and over? Actually, so that's about, it's not just about getting better metrics, but also about building credibility in your channels, in you as a function, in you as an organization, the organization behind it. And that starts to contribute to all sorts of things around alignment and so on. Ultimately, it's saying, I respect your time and I care about you as an individual, which is quite difficult to do. So, I won't labor the point around what that might mean for good comms and how that might impact things like, profitability or absenteeism. But, we're all in comms. We all know about that already.
Yes. And I think that's probably the biggest point is reestablishing trust that I'm a human being and I work here and that people respect me. And any of the steps that we're about to talk about, taking any of these will help reestablish that trust and increase engagement.
Absolutely. Let's get into the meat of it, shall we?
Let's do it.
Here we go, making it happen. So we covered a bit around like kind of what targeting and personalization are and why they matter. So it's time to get practical, shall we? How do we actually do this? How do we move from theory to action? Particularly, I suspect there's lots of people on the call who where they're maybe under-resourced and their IT support is should we say, limited.
It's very kind of you.
We've all been on that side of the desk. The good news is I think you don't really need to start from scratch. There's a lot that we can borrow from external marketing, from best practices in the private sector as well, but also adapt that for internal use. So let's have a look. I've got it up on screen already. Marketers have been using targeting for years, and not to be creepy, well, maybe not just to be creepy, but to be effective, to reach the right people at the right time. And there's a few things that I thought would be useful to talk about how we can borrow from them. If you've got marketing people in your team, maybe have a chat with them about how you can do some of this, because this is, the building blocks that I think we can learn a lot from. To start with, I like to talk about how marketers build personas. They're fictional but data-informed representations of key customer groups, in our case, key internal employee groups. But, that could be frontline workers, desk workers, new joiners. We talked about some of them already, those line managers, execs, whatever it might be, but also things like regional and business unit differences. They've all got different information needs, different preferred channels, maybe different pain points as well. So understanding all of those can help us with where we begin with our targeting. And then we get a little bit into that kind of behavioral data. So marketers don't just segment by demographics, they also segment, as you talked about, by behavior, how we clicked, what we bought maybe, or what our preferences are. So we can do the same internally, thinking about, our internet analytics, what content got read, what are our email metrics, who's opening what, on our learning platforms, who's engaging with training, and where do we maybe need to focus a bit more with people who aren't engaging. And we've got surveys, and we've got, actually, as organizations, we've got loads of data. Are we using that data on how people engage to give us insight into what's working and what isn't? And the other thing is really thinking about Marketers also think in journeys. So, awareness, consideration, action is a flow that many of us will be familiar with, but we can apply that also at work, pre-boarding, onboarding, probation, how we progress through our careers, people returning from different types of leave, perhaps, or people who are exiting. What about our alumni? So each of those stages has got different needs, but we can think about those as we start to plan what people's communications needs might be and how we can tailor what we provide to meet those different needs for our audiences, right?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I think I like that we're getting internal communicators to hear just these concepts because again, things are walled off and maybe they're not seeing what other organizations are doing, or if they don't report into marketing, and oftentimes internal communications doesn't, these are new concepts, but they work. They are proven. And again, I just go back to Netflix and other brands that you already engage with. There's a reason that they're so effective. When there's so much demand for your attention, why do you keep going back? Because it feels like they're saving me time because they know me. And
Yeah.
these are a lot of the techniques that they are using that can be applied to internal communication.
Absolutely. If you think about, anyone on the call, if you think about the last few things you genuinely actioned out of your inbox, they are marketers that use these type of techniques. What did you actually go and buy? It's usually because you've been retargeted on the basis of something you bought before, things that you like, or, your sort of stage of life. They'll know that it's this time of year and you always buy your kids presents this time of year. It's logged somewhere. So there's some useful techniques there that we can learn from marketing as well, which segues neatly on into the toolkit. So we touched on this earlier, but segmentation is just a smart starting point. It's like slicing your organization or your audience into meaningful groups so you can send what's relevant to them. So, that can be role, HR, whatever, the seniority. So individual contributors, leaders, managers. Obvious one is location. That can be time zones, but also what site they might be on, or if they're in lots of different countries. And there can also be interests and behaviors as well. So people who've completed a survey, opened a previous campaign, joined an employee resource group, perhaps. This data is in your HRIS already, right? The problem, as you touched on, is often accessing and using it, but we have so much data. We've probably got richer data on our employees than we do on our customers. So if we use it, we can get some really powerful results.
Yes, I think some examples that come to mind are this idea of, let's say you're using Workday or ADP or SAP, it doesn't really matter. And I've just been promoted and I've become a people manager for the first time. Wouldn't it be great if that triggered a series of communication? It would be the same as you go to a site, a retail site, and you buy something for the first time and you're a first time customer. And now you're starting to receive a series of communication. Great, you're earning reward points. Do you know this? Like, it's all about hitting you with the right information at the right time. So that's a great example of, I know who that person is and I know they're going to need this type of information. I think the issue, honestly, Sharon, is that most internal communication staffs that we see are so under-resourced. So they're hearing us talk about these amazing things, and I know they're probably cussing under their breath or worse. Like, we don't have time. We're drowning, right? I'm just trying to keep up. Here's the amazing thing. If you can get here, it frees up your time. To me, it feels like the person that's so busy drowning, they can't see the life preserver. There are tools and technology that are available now to take a lot of the mundane manual tasks off your plate so you can focus on the next evolution of engagement within your company.
Exactly. So, I mean, let's be honest, it does take a little bit of work up front, setting these audiences up, setting the tools up front, and learning how to, set up things like dynamic content or automated journeys, which I'll talk about very briefly in just a moment. But actually, once you've got it, you can focus on, because ultimately we don't come into comms to be channel managers, we came in to communicate. And that, we want to talk about being a strategic advisor, to be, influencing in the organization rather than just doing the mechanics of managing channels. once you've got these flows setting up, it does, in theory at least, free up your time to focus on that kind of higher value work. Just briefly touch on these two things before I move on then. Dynamic content is, you touched on it earlier, about how you might show different blocks of content. If you've read something before, don't show it to you again. You know, everyone might see the intro from the CEO, but sales will see a case study and tech might see a product update, say. So it's like you say, the tools are out there. Particularly, you can integrate cross-channel with, you know, an intranet with personalization capability, but you can do it manually at a small scale to some degree. And then I also briefly wanted to touch on automated journeys, which is understanding that people might do a series of steps across maybe a point of their employee life cycle. So instead of blasting out one-time messages, you've got automated triggered communications. So could be a welcome email on your first day, but then like a survey a week later, 2 weeks later to see how it's settling in. Maybe some sort of reminder when you finish your probation to do your benefits, and then maybe some nudges to complete a course. So you're guiding people through the experience rather than just sending one email that's saying these are the 6 things you've got to do in the next 6 months, which will get lost in their inbox, right? So simple journeys like those onboarding sequences can improve relevance, but they also reduce noise and get cut through. And I think you touched on this a little bit, which is, you know, it does sound quite overwhelming, doesn't it? If your comms team isn't swimming in tech, doesn't know or have access to the right kind of data. But I think I wanted to kind of touch on where you can get started, I suppose. And the truth is, you don't have to do it all at once. Let's just start small. You know, pick one message, one audience, one variable. Tailor your next newsletter by region. Pilot a dynamic message for new joiners, and then you can show it works, show it scales. You know, think about using the things you've already got. So in your HR system, those roles, departments, locations, the data might not be as rich as you would like it to be, but if you've got some and you can show it works, you can start to build the case for cleaning up that data, say. You've got some stuff out there, like maybe on your learning platform, in your survey tools, we've got loads of data out there. And your intranet, whatever platform you're using, you'll have lots of content engagement data. See, you may not need to use new platforms or buy new platforms, but just use smarter ones more effectively. And I guess the other thing I had was around kind of testing and iterating. Marketing teams are testing everything. I read recently, talking about Netflix, you know, the little thumbnail message, they A/B test like every possible iteration of what is most likely to make you click on that particular film, series, documentary. So they have thousands of different versions of every little thumbnail message. You know, of course, we're never going to do that, but we can test and refine our messages and also how we do this personalization and targeting. I wondered if, because it's not about being perfect, right? It's about making progress. So have you got any kind of tips on getting started?
Yes, I think anything small. The big issue that I think internal communicators face is that everyone sees their work.
Yeah.
And so they don't want to make a mistake because everybody sees your work. So how can you test that, you know, within a safe department potentially? If you report into marketing, let's test it on marketing. If you report into HR, great. Let's test there and make sure everything's working the way you want it to work before and after. The other thing I would say is internal communicators had a seat at the table during COVID, and then I think it went away.
Yeah,
Kind of,
true.
we've gone back to just get this out. And so tying your work eventually to business value.
Yeah.
So if you can show this campaign that we did last year led to X, less liability, less accidents, more people enrolling in benefits, whatever the behavior is that you want, that's real dollars to the business. And you can use that to make a business case to continue down this path of getting to a consumer grade experience.
Absolutely. So start small, use what you've got, keep aiming for relevance over reach. And as you know, internal comms, as in life, being useful beats being seen, in my view. Let's have a look at some of our foundations then. I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes left. The big things, we covered the kind of why and the how, you know, how targeting personalization can help us cut through the noise, but you need the right foundations in place. So the platforms, the processes, the data, the structures that you need to make that personalization sustainable. So the big one for me, it's got to be like the fundamental one is data. You know, what's our single source of truth? To personalize effectively, you need to know who your employees are, where they work, what roles they're in, what content they've engaged with, and ultimately what they need and when. But the challenge we find is often that data is quite fragmented, right?
Yes, it's normally, we have one customer that has 26 different people data systems because they've grown through acquisition.
Yep.
So imagine the difficulty of even just sending a message to people that meet certain criteria, open enrollments beginning whenever.
Yep.
Was impossible for them. So there has to be a way to bring it all together so they can communicate and be fluid and not be handcuffed.
Absolutely. So the first step is always bringing that data together, or at least making sure the systems can talk to each other, right? So whether that's through like a data warehouse or employee profile service, better integrations, but any sort of support that you can get to get that kind of meaningful personalization. And then another one which I bang on about all the time is the need for governance. So alongside good data, you need to have good rules around kind of how channels are used, how your data is used, how your segments are defined, how content gets approved. It sounds boring, but it's what stops you sending 12 conflicting messages to the same person on the same day. It's what helps us to prioritize, but also to make sure that people still trust our channels. So it can be pretty light touch, but I always advise people to make sure we've got some more baseline governance in place to get started.
Yep, great suggestions.
You're the expert here, but let's talk about tools and technologies.
Yeah, so absolutely. So um, again, we go back to data. So analytics, like you have to be able to measure. If you're sending email today and you have no analytics, that's a huge red flag. So we don't know who's engaging, who's not engaging, who's seen it, who still needs to see it. That's a problem. Intranets are, even if you have SharePoint, that has the ability to be personalized. So I don't want people to think I have to go spend a bunch of money or get IT to upgrade whatever. Um, what you have in place almost always is good enough. We just want to take it the next couple of twists of the dial to make it amazing. So probably the key takeaway here is this doesn't require huge spend to upgrade your communication stack. It is really just understanding the art of what's possible.
Absolutely. It's something back in the day we used to find that everyone needed a new platform. Nowadays, most people have the right tools already. They just could be making them work a bit harder.
Yes.
Like getting the right processes, the right data in place so that you're really sweating the assets that you have a lot harder. So, it's where we've got a big complex workforce with multiple touch points. We've got so much potential to be able to cut through a lot more, but we need to kind of think about blending employee experience with kind of campaign management, which is really a mindset change rather than a tool one, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So do you want to
Shall I move
give some
on about
tips?
scaling that one? Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about, you need to think about getting your data in place, you've got the right kind of tools there, but how do we make sure that we're not making every campaign like a 40-hour project? Because that's just not going to happen. And for me, it's about, we don't have to start from scratch every time. Think about getting templates in place with like defined content blocks, how we make things fixed versus flexible, newsletter formats. Design needs to be modular so that we can plug and play with different content for different audiences without rewriting the whole thing every time. Yes, that saves us time, but it's also about creating consistency, tone in there on expectations. And the big one for me is automate when we can. The real power comes when this is just an embedded process. Got to invest some time up front in making it happen, but then it is much more, it becomes just a standard workflow in making this happen. Particularly we're thinking about things like automated journeys, they just happen automatically. We don't need to think about sending mail blasts out to new joiners. It should, happen in the background. It's plumbing, right?
Yes. All right, let's get to the last kind of
Conscious
couple of
time, yeah.
topics and then make sure we leave a few minutes at least for Q&A.
Yay. Okay, let's do that. So where am I? Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit because this is all about how do we choose what we send to people. But I wanted to also make sure we talk about the power of choice or agency. Because even with all the personalization in the world, smart segments, dynamic content, whatever, we're all working from that assumption that we decide what you get. So what we're calling the prescribed model. I know what you should know, and I'm going to make sure you get it. That's definitely true. That is a challenge in internal comms. There are things we have to tell people: compliance, critical updates, anything about safety, let's say. But that isn't the only model. People get disengaged when you just bombard them with stuff they didn't ask for. They stop trusting the channel. So we need to think about also the subscribe model as well. So that's kind of a combination of you decide, prescribers, we set the audience, the message, the timing. Subscribers when the employee chooses, opting into topics, to channels and things that interest them, right?
Yeah. And we, as we learn more about kind of the real needs of internal communicators, we found that the right flow is what the communicator needs to say is always front and center. So they
Yeah,
have control over the prescribe. You must see the message from the CEO, and then you blend it with the subscribe. So on the next slide, kind of talk a little bit about how we think about the finding the right balance between prescribe and subscribe, because
yeah,
this is not a marketing exercise. It can't just be about what they care about. You work at a company, you need to know these things. So that's where ideally you will get to this place of a really nice balance of they get what they need to see, supported with what they actually care about and haven't already seen somewhere else.
exactly. So subscribe models is about building that trust. They make people feel in control of the noise, but they also help us to understand what people want to hear more about as well. What do we get that sort of insight into people as well. So just flick on to here. Yeah. Finding that balance then, allowing people to decide what they get, but also giving people a bit of choice in like frequency and format. We generally, programmed to be slightly more responsive to things that we chose to do than that's sent to us without us asking. So it's about creating space for relevance too.
Yeah. All right, I'll give one example and then we can, I think, open it up for some questions. So if you want to
Okay, yeah.
skip a couple slides.
This one here.
In real life, as the kids like to say.
Go on then.
All right, so this is real. So these are something that we produce. They're called news digests. So our clients use this functionality to build a newsletter for every single employee based on what they need to know automatically that they haven't already seen somewhere else, and what they want to know, what it's learning. Either they've opted in, like we saw on the previous slide, or it's learned about them through their behavior. Sharon constantly engaging with community service related content. She doesn't need to know that to do her job. That's what she cares about as a human. So even for Linda Smith, comms director, you can see recommended for you.
Yeah.
That is based on what she's asked for and based on what her behavior is telling us she cares about. So that is the manifestation of this balance of prescribe and subscribe in real life. Okay,
Yeah, that seemed
that was a
really powerful as
lot.
well. So people can understand as well and see why have I see why, why am I seeing this piece of communication? Because you chose to, or because we can see that it's relevant to you and your role. So just to quickly wrap up then, I'm conscious we've just got a few minutes. Oops, there we go. How do we bring it all together? So, how do we make relevance real? We covered a lot today, the challenges of overload, some of the practical tactics. How do we make comms more useful? And it is all about making it more relevant, because when we're all getting so much, then the relevance is the antidote to overload, right? So to get there, we need to move beyond just sending a bit less to sending more smarter. And I think that's understanding that, personalization and segmentation are two different things. Personalization, not the same as segmentation, they're both important. It's about targeting the right message to the right group, but also layering in that personalization. So it tailors the message so it's meant for every individual, name, location, whatever it might be. It's a smart distribution strategy, but it's about also making content resonate, and you need both and make sure they work together. Start with what you have. So, we've said you don't need to overhaul your entire comm stack. We probably have, you need your HR data, you need some sort of comms platform like an intranet or an email platform, you need analytics, and most importantly, you just need your team who understand the audience. So you've got data, tools, and good intent, then you're probably ready to get started. Start small, test, and maybe build from there. My other bit was about respecting the reader. We talked about a lot today about targeting, about subscribe models, but ultimately it's all about respecting the audience's time and attention. Don't send everything to everyone. Don't assume that one size fits all, and don't confuse visibility with value. Relevance can often come from what you chose not to send. And then the final one for me, which I thought was really important, is it's about knowing people, not just data. So, as communicators, we're kind of people, and it's tempting to rely on data, segments, click rates, behaviors. But relevance is also about empathy, getting that feel for what people want, what they need, what they expect. Data tells us what people are doing, but it's our human understanding that tells us why they're doing it and what they want to do about it. So don't just design this by spreadsheet. It's about listening, observing, asking, and using that insight, our understanding of people, to design better experiences. So the goal isn't to make everything perfect, it's just to make maybe more relevant, more respectful, more useful.
I love that. That was excellent. I love how you ended it. So
A
one of
little
the
bit
lines
rusty
I
as
always
always.
use, you did great. One of the lines I always use is, how would you want to be communicated to? Let's do that. And and I think most internal communicators, that really resonates with them, but then they say, I don't know how. I don't know how to actually implement. I'm not in charge of X, Y, and Z. So hopefully this was helpful. There are lots of baby steps you can do to get to better targeting, better personalization, and ultimately better relevance. But fundamentally, as long as you're moving your organization closer to that consumer grade experience, you're doing the right things.
Fantastic. I realized that one, we are just on time, but do we have any questions in, or shall we wrap up there? Oh, hang on, let's see what we've got here. So from Jasmine, as an organization, we've made a concerted effort to cut down on the quantity of emails and minimize noise for employees through more targeted messaging. However, we are seeing less participation in culture campaigns like company-wide recognition or local events. How do we bring more importance to those types of campaigns without bombarding employees with reminders? That's a really interesting question. Do you want to pick that one up, or should I try and make a start on it?
I'm happy to jump in.
And
Great question.
yes.
So I think at the end of the day, it's a blend of, you've got corporate communication, then you've got local hyper targeted communication, as long as it's about me. So if there's I don't know what tools you're using, I'm happy to, I think our LinkedIn and things are on the next slide, email addresses, happy to stay connected. But if you let us, or let me know what types of technologies you're using, there are ways to get around this problem and really merge this idea of, it's not corporate communication, it's not departmental communication, it's not business unit, it is you. What does this employee care about, and what do they need to see? And so finding the right balance. But I'd love to know the tools that you're using, and then we could talk about maybe different tips and tricks to get you there.
Probably just a very quick build on that one. I think it's also a recognition that we can't fix everything. And sometimes it may be that there's an external factor that is driving a decreased engagement with, for instance, a community campaign. It may be that the sort of environmental noise, there might be other organizational change. So it's also being conscious that it's not just about data, it's also having that broader awareness of context that might be affecting why people are engaging or otherwise. So as a general point, I've noticed that that's probably true across a lot of organizations we're working with. And that may be because the economic context is such that people are actually less focused on the kind of more cultural side of work and much more on the kind of the operational side. We're seeing less engagement with things like employee resource groups, as well as people are kind of focusing a bit more on, frankly, like job losses and such, like in tougher economic times. Obviously, I can't comment on your organization specifically, but it is a trend that we're seeing elsewhere. So it may be that it's not about the delivery at all. It may be about understanding the broader context. But the other thing I would probably respond on that one is also understand what worked before, because it's actually about kind of where can we test and learn based on what campaigns landed in the past, and maybe thinking about where there might be best practices that we've learned from previous successful communications that we can redeploy. Or the other one that I will just quickly do is actually understanding the context in which people are receiving your message. So is it that we need to think about different formats for that type of messaging? Are they only in a position to respond to it maybe at a particular time and place? So I'm conscious that we've gone a couple of minutes over time. So I'll quickly, unless we have any other questions, just flick on to a little bit of a thank you and a wrap up.
I'll thank you. You are wonderful. Hopefully, people found value in this topic. It is certainly top of mind for a lot of organizations, obviously, that we're talking to. So, Sharon, thank you very much. Super insightful. I loved having you as a guest.
Thank you for having me on. Thanks everyone for your time, your attention. And thank you so much for inviting me on. I love to geek out on this sort of thing. So if you want to stay in touch, yeah, I think you can scan the QR on the screen and get my LinkedIn, or you can just email me. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. We'll send out an email with all of these materials right after the webinar.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.